Right, so good morning everybody, and thank you very much for joining this webinar today on Is Your Data Cloud Ready? This webinar is brought to you today by Automated Intelligence. My name is Matt Maunder, and I will be taking you through today's session around the cloud and Is Your Data Cloud Ready? Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This will be approximately a 30-minute session today. So after the session, there will be some time for Q&A. Any questions you have can be asked through the question panel we'll have in GoToMeeting. If you do have any questions, please do post them in that, and we'll endeavour to ask those at the end of the session. If you're having any technical difficulties, audio issues, visual issues, and so forth, everything is today provided through GoToWebinar. So any issues, if you please contact my colleague Nuala, who is in the Q&A pane. You can actually instigate a private chat with her so that she can assist you should you have any challenges. So today's agenda, what are we kicking off with? Well, frankly, at the moment, everyone is talking about the cloud in some way, shape or form. There is this desire to build a cloud strategy, but there are a number of challenges around adopting the cloud. Where do you store your data? How do you move to the cloud? And how do you understand the kind of information that you have to ensure that the right data is stored in the session? So today's session will be ultimately taking you through all of these aspects, reiterating some of the challenges that you may or may not be aware of yet, and then how we can best move you to the cloud through some of the mechanisms that we can suggest. And as I say, at the end of the session, we'll be taking some Q&A, so please do pose any questions you have through the GoToWebinar window. So, why cloud? Why is everybody talking about the cloud? Well, frankly, we speak to clients day in and day out for a number of topics, but inevitably the subject of cloud comes up. Everyone has some kind of cloud agenda, whether it's the smallest council right to the largest bank. Everyone is looking at the cloud and saying, how can I adopt this? How can I take some of the benefits from adopting a cloud-based platform? Now, one of the key reasons for that, and this may sound relatively obvious, is that there are inevitable cost benefits from moving away from the cloud, moving away from this traditional on-premise hardware ownership model to really realize the benefits of a cloud-based platform. And so, whilst cost can be a huge driving factor by reducing the amount of storage you have to adopt, the amount of infrastructure you need to manage, etc., that may not be the only reason. And whilst we've seen clients save around 70% of their savings through reduced storage and so forth alone, there may be other reasons for wanting to adopt a cloud-based platform. Things like enhanced scalability, enabling you to be more agile and more flexible. Reducing the management overhead, it really can be a huge catalyst to expanding and growing the business that you potentially are in. So whilst cost can be a huge driving factor, there are lots of other reasons as well in terms of moving to the cloud-based platform, reducing the amount of support you need to provide. The list kind of goes on and on. But unfortunately, there is a significant amount of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around adopting and moving to the cloud. What about things like security, accessibility? Who can see my data? Am I being compliant with all the legal, regulatory, and internal policy obligations I have to comply with? So it's fair to say that not necessarily everyone is right for the cloud, and not all content, not all data is necessarily right for the cloud as well. And this is really one of the key subjects of today's seminar and today's webinar, is how we can actually look at that from a data perspective. Because as I've already mentioned, cloud allows us to reduce the amount of data that's stored on site and reduce that cost. And we can also think about rationalizing and consolidating the various applications and platforms that contribute to the data that I have to store on premise. But one of the huge challenges that, again, we see day in and day out when speaking to our clients is, how do I know what I can move to the cloud? Or even, how do I know what information I have in the first place? And so that's one of the things we're also going to be looking at today. Because if you can accurately profile your data, we can maybe start looking at some of the more hybrid approaches to the cloud, and that enable us to get the best of both worlds, storing some content and some applications on premise where appropriate, but again, leveraging the economies of scale and benefits that cloud provides for the right type of information, the right applications. And that's something that's quite core to what we do at Automated Intelligence, and something we want to kind of explain how we can approach some of these objectives. But ultimately, the key is understanding what should move to the cloud and the best way of getting it there. So let's think about the current state. And again, some of these areas may resonate with you in terms of your current environment and maybe what you're currently doing today. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, there are millions and billions of content being stored on-premise in a lot of businesses. That data growth is storing exponentially. You know, as more devices are introduced, as more platforms are introduced that contribute to the storage of content and the creation of content, that data growth stores exponentially. And so content is going to grow year on year at a significant rate. Platforms like SharePoint, for example, really do fuel that growth through improved collaboration, easy data sharing, being able to better create content. This is fueling that data growth. And again, that whilst that's fantastic in terms of the type of information and knowledge we can store within our business, it again contributes to some of the challenges around storage cost, discoverability, and so forth. Now, if we think about that and we think about how that data or how that challenge can grow exponentially, then we have to start thinking about that strategy in terms of, if I have this huge data growth, which likely you do, where should it be stored? Should I be storing it in the cloud? Should it be in on-premise? And with that data growth, we need to understand the information that we have. We need to understand what data is sensitive, what can be thought of as public, what needs to be, where content needs to have a policy applied or stored for a certain length of time. So we have this data growth, but we also have this challenge around understanding the information we have in the first place. And of course, as content grows, then that, again, that issue around understanding the information we have will grow exponentially. So as an example, we're speaking to some banks in Wall Street at the moment in New York. And one of the banks we're speaking to have something like a $1 billion ICT budget. Now, 25% of that budget is stored on storage alone. So that's a huge amount of money to be stored purely on content. Now, they have a cloud strategy, or they want a cloud strategy, but they don't know how to get there. Because of the data they're storing, they don't know what information should be stored in the cloud, or how they can start leveraging some of these other alternative platforms. Really what they're doing is kind of taking a more highest common denominator approach and saying, let's store all everything on-premise because that's the safest place to do it. Let's mitigate our risk because we don't understand what we've got, so let's keep it all there. And of course then that's contributing to these huge storage costs and the challenges around data scaling and scaling the infrastructure as well. So ultimately, a lot of data, and we need to have a better understanding of what we have. And of course, one of the other challenges that I'm sure you're familiar with is the user is surrounded by huge amounts of these data silos. So whether it's legacy records and document management platforms, other ECM platforms, file shares, physical records and filing cabinets, they still exist. Email, content stored on people's desktop which no one else can access. These are all things that are not only causing us to not understand the information we've got, but it's fueling that growth of data. But of course, having it in all these different places means that content is much harder to manage. And frankly, we don't understand what is there in the first place because it's incredibly challenging to profile and manage and report on the variety and plethora of data silos, for want of a better term, that exist within the business. So there is a huge amount of benefit in thinking about how we can consolidate all of these platforms into a single location as long as the content is stored in the right place. And that's, again, something we're going to be talking about shortly. I mean, if you take a prime example of this, we talk about, I mean, another data silo that can be considered is the cloud itself. Now, the chances are, whether you have a cloud strategy in place or not, your users are utilizing the cloud. Time and time again, we go in and their users want to share information internally or externally. So they use things like OneDrive, Dropbox, Google Drive, whatever they want to use, whatever they're familiar and comfortable with to share and store content and to enable that content to be stored across all of their different devices. It's great. It's a great way of sharing data. But of course, you lose control over that information. You aren't able to apply your policy. You aren't able to understand what content is out there in the wild as it effectively is. So whether you like it or not, your users may be, and our chances are they are adopting a cloud-based approach. So what we really need to do is to enable your users to embrace the cloud, but do it in a managed and structured way so that we can ensure that we can leverage the benefits of the cloud. Your users can do things in a familiar way that enables them to do their job with ease, but ultimately we do it in a structured, managed, and governed way. And then, of course, you probably have these legacy systems that exist at the moment where you want to move away from, but you're just not really sure how. So again, we want to start thinking about how we consolidate the information from these legacy records and document management platforms which your users don't adopt, they're very hard to use, and bring it all together into something that your users are going to love to use. So what's the first stage? So from our perspective, we see the first stage is the kind of the preparation. And really, as I've already been talking about, it's preparing to go to the cloud, and it's understanding the information that you have. It's the data profiling. So it's understanding what kinds of information that's there. And, you know, we can look at it at quite a deep level and say what information is categorized for different departments, teams, what's sensitive, what's secure, what's public, and so forth. But we can take a kind of a broader step, if you like, at the very first level and start thinking about, well, what about information which just I need versus I don't need? What content has been duplicated? What content is redundant? And then we can start looking at that, and when we start segregating that data effectively, we can then start thinking about how we apply policy to the useful data. We can start mitigating risk by taking out that bulk of information which the business doesn't need or isn't relevant to them. And that's kind of the first step in ensuring we can effectively manage and govern the information that we have, and then identify what content is appropriate for moving to the cloud. So our first typical step when we're speaking to clients is a kind of a data analytics approach. It's looking at their information across their data sources and saying what information is useful and what is redundant, what is duplicated, what is obsolete and trivial. And by that I mean old data. Making sure we're not storing users' holiday snaps, for example, and just content which is irrelevant to the business. If we can first of all just segregate that data from useful and irrelevant and duplicated data, that's our first step in understanding how we can best move that useful data to the cloud. Now, it's not to say that the rest of the data must be got rid of completely. There are other mechanisms we can look at in treating that information. But in terms of risk mitigation and understanding our data, let's have a look at what is useful to the business. And when we start segregating that, this is an approach we've taken with over 40 of our customers. And on average, we've saved around, well, we've looked at potential savings of around 58% in terms of reducing that level of storage, taking that irrelevant, redundant, and duplicate data from primary tier 1 storage and either archiving it or removing it completely. Left with the useful data, there's a potential saving of around 58%, which can be massive. You consider that billion-dollar IT budget I was talking about earlier, potential for huge savings there. But of course, that's, like I've already said, that's not necessarily the only savings that we're potentially going to make. We start thinking about then the reduced management overhead, the reduced infrastructure that we need, and all the other additional costs that come with storing that data. Those savings can rise to even 70% or even beyond. One local authority we've finished working with now have had something like an 87% rot rate, redundant, obsolete, and trivial. That's a huge amount of data that they discovered they just did not need to store. So removing that had a significant benefit to their business. And so this is the first step. This is almost like the business case that's going to enable us to say, this is the information that is useful to me. This is what I potentially want to move to the cloud or to some sort of other platform. So to do that and to kind of kick off that approach, we have an analytics tool that allows us to look at that data and understand the information that we have. So what I'm just going to briefly do now, I'm just going to switch out from my slide, and I'm going to share with you a short demonstration and show you how this could potentially work. So what I'm displaying on the screen now is our AI analytics tool. AI analytics is a tool that you run within your organization that allows you to crawl the different file shares and different data stores that you have within your environment. So as you can see from the tool I'm showing you right now, it gives us a few key statistics at the very beginning. So we can see, for example, when we run this solution, the amount of files that you have, the amount of storage that's required, the amount of folders that you have, and so forth. So it gives you some great top-level statistics. But as you can see in this example, we can also detect things like the duplicates, the absolute duplicates that you have in your content stores, and also look at the redundant files. So when I say redundant, I mean file types that aren't necessarily useful to the business, old files, things of that nature. The redundant files are something that we can, of course, customize. Duplicates are naturally duplicates. But ultimately, what we're looking at here is saving potentially 48% in terms of removing that level of duplication and redundancy through this analytics tool. Through that, in this example, we can see a 24 terabyte saving and potential reduction in cost of around £624,000. I mean, that's massive, naturally. So this is something, though, that we can utilize in your organization to establish the kinds of levels of savings that we can make by reducing that level of duplication redundancy and profiling the data at that very top level. And as we drill down, we can get some further statistics as well. So things like popular file types and the level of duplication there. So what kind of information is being duplicated. Office documents tend to be a prime target for that, whereas email tends to be single version of the truth and doesn't get duplicated as heavily. So we can start drilling down at this very first stage and just understanding the types of content that you have. We can look at areas as popular file sizes and, again, the levels of duplication at the different categories that we have. What becomes particularly interesting there is then we can start mapping things like trends. So in this case, we can look at how the data has grown over time and what is that going to look like over the next 5-6 years. Typically, we see this kind of hockey stick where your data has grown to a certain level, but you won't get this linear curve. You'll get this exponential growth because as data grows, as more devices are introduced, as more platforms and more users are introduced into the business, there's always going to be an exponential growth of content. And again, this is incredibly important to see because as we say, well, what happened? Gives us an approach to say, well, if we do nothing, what is that going to look like? How is that problem going to be compounded over time? So it gives us a really good picture to say, this is the issue that I've got. This is why I need to do something about it. And again, we can start doing that mapping in terms of the levels of duplication that we have as well. So again, we can get that level of growth of duplication as time goes on. So again, we're getting a very good picture of what potentially may happen in a few years' time, as well as what is currently the case now. But then what we can do in this first stage is then we can say, well, what happens next? What do we do about this? So we have a process by which we can say, this is currently our data growth up until now, and this is what it's going to look like in the future. So what would happen if I delete this data? So as you can see, there's a dramatic reduction in cost. If we remove that duplicate and redundant information, we get a significant reduction in the cost of storage and the amount of content we have by reducing the amount of content we have to store in the first place. And you can see from the table some of the figures that we can see in terms of reducing the level of duplication redundancy. Quite frankly, though, that's not necessarily going to be for everybody. Very few clients of ours will actually say just remove everything that we consider duplicate and redundant. So what we're probably going to want to do is archive that data. We will reduce the level of storage for redundant, obsolete, trivial, duplicated data. We'll only store our relevant content in the primary platforms that we want to deliver. That may be in the cloud. It may be on-premise. But that data that we don't necessarily need, we can potentially move to an archive. And that archive may be something like Windows Azure or something like that. So, and again, a cloud platform might be appropriate, but a cheaper, less managed platform to store that archive data. But of course, we can then start looking at applying managed retention around that data as well. So again, whilst we're not going to see the kinds of savings we would see when if we get rid of it completely, what we are saying is if we can segregate that data, remove that older or irrelevant data, archive it off and leverage some of the economies of scale that cloud platforms deliver for that type of information, we can see some very big potential savings. So really this analytics process is designed to be the business case. It's designed to be the approach by which we say, what have you got in your environment, what is useful, what is not, and how can we start helping you further? So that's the AI analytics approach. What I'm going to do now, I'm just going to go back to my slides and then I'm going to say, and we're going to look at what is the next step after we've done that, looked at that approach. So what's the next stage? So the next stage is really preparing to move to the cloud. Once we've understand the business case, we understand the information that we've got, we can start looking at that preparation approach of understanding in further detail the kind of information that we have. Is it do we have content needs to be secured? Is sensitive? Do we want to categorize by certain types of department and so forth? Frankly, when we start looking at this phase, there is no silver bullet. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. But what we can do is start dissecting the content that you have through various categorization and extraction techniques to look at the information that you have, effectively categorize it, and then start establishing of that useful information that you have and you need to keep, what is appropriate for a cloud-based platform, what can be archived, and what can be stored, what potentially needs to stay on-premise. So we can work with you, understand the kind of information you have, understand your policies, understand the kind of categories that you have, and then we can establish where that information needs to go. And this has been done successfully on numerous occasions. We've worked with several central government organizations, for example, who you may think the government don't have it might be behind the curve in terms of cloud, but actually they have a very public cloud agenda. They're very keen to move to the cloud, and we've on several occasions actually demonstrated how we can do that. One central government agency, for example, who have a lot of secure and sensitive data, we've transitioned completely to the cloud. Their entire estate moved to a hosted platform, including file shares, legacy platform, SharePoint, and so forth. And we did that by effectively categorizing and profiling their information and then working with them to establish the best way to move to cloud-based platform versus information that needs to stay on-premise. And we do that via AI data point. So data point is our approach and our methodology and our solution to moving to potentially to the cloud or to other platforms that you require to. So just by way of an example and to illustrate how we can do this, I just want to go through this approach with you now. So let's take an example where we have legacy content management, records management platforms, file shares, emails, and other platforms that may exist within the business. And we'll bring in AI data point. Think of data point as a tool, as an engine that's going to drive the move to the cloud through a rules-based approach and through a categorization and profiling process so that we can ensure we understand the information we have, move that content, and consolidate all of those sources into the cloud. So what we can do is, as I say, we'll connect to various platforms that you have. And there are numerous examples we have of connecting to all sorts of platforms, legacy, records management, EDRM, file shares, and so forth. So that data that is going to exist in all those different platforms may be secure, sensitive, irrelevant, trivial, duplicated, useful. They'll have various kind of categories around that. And we'll feed that information and that content into data point. And then what we'll do is we'll run it through a set of processes to ensure that we can accurately categorize and profile that data. The first step is to identify the redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, as I've described, where we can identify in the analytics approach. So we'll do the same thing to ensure that we can identify what information is not necessarily useful to the business and categorize it appropriately based upon your own rules and what you consider to be rot. We'll then deduplicate, so we'll ensure we remove the duplicates so that, again, we're only storing a single version of the truth and we're removing the need to store the same content again and again and significantly reduce the storage there. We'll then look to categorize that data, and we have various techniques so we can actually look at the content itself and establish the types of content that you have. So we'll look at keywords, we'll look at patterns, we'll look at the metadata of the content. Data point will effectively learn based upon your profiles and your the relevant data to you and establish the kind of information that we have. So as another example, we had to migrate for one client patient records from one source into SharePoint. So we look for things like patient ID numbers and so forth and categorize that as a patient record which was sensitive and treated that data appropriately. So we're really looking at the types of information that you have, and then we're fully understanding and categorizing it based upon the content and the information surrounding that data. Once we've done that, we can then transform the data. We can apply metadata, ensure policies are applied or permissions, whatever it is you need to do to enhance the context of the information so that when we, for example, migrate that content into SharePoint, It has the context. It has the metadata, so that discoverability is much easier. We don't have all of these silos. Information is being stored in a single platform or a hybrid platform. Users can easily find it. And again, that content might be, if we take SharePoint as a prime example, we might be moving to SharePoint on-premise for secure data, whereas data we want to keep but doesn't necessarily need to be secured, or we feel appropriate to be stored in the cloud, we can move to, for example, SharePoint and Office 365. So based upon all these categorization techniques and other mechanisms, we'll ensure the right information is moved to the cloud, whereas content we want to keep on-premise is stored appropriately. And then for other information, content we might consider needs to be archived, older data, redundant data, but we still need to keep. We might then migrate into an intelligent archive. So that might be something like Windows Azure or something along those lines, where the cost per terabyte is incredibly cheap, so we can leverage the economy of scale that a cloud platform provides to store that data, but in a much cheaper way, in ensuring that information is stored appropriately. And then wherever we store that information, we can then look to apply policy. We have a number of techniques and mechanisms and solutions to ensure that whether you're on-premise, Office 365 in the cloud, using cloud storage, policies can be applied to ensure that the data is stored in the right way, in the right format, for the right length of time to meet your governance and legislative policies. DataPoint is an incredibly extensible platform. So whatever your requirements are, we will work with you to ensure that we can run through this process to ensure the information that you wish to migrate, the platforms you look to consolidate, or the information you look to migrate to the cloud is done effectively in the right way, and ensuring that you mitigate your risks of storing content in the cloud where appropriate. So just to give you a couple of examples of this as well. So, I've already given examples of how we've consolidated data for other clients. So, another central government client that we work with, we used this exact process to profile their data, and we only took around 30% of their data into a clean platform, into a clean cloud platform, SharePoint cloud-based platform. So that information was deemed useful to be stored in the cloud, relevant to the business, and so forth. The rest of the data that we took, we parked in an archive platform, and we applied managed retention to it. We've done that on several occasions where we've profiled the data, taken the useful information, moved it to the cloud. So there are several examples that we can give whereby we've run through this process successfully to move sensitive data, useful data to the most appropriate platform, whether it's the cloud or otherwise. So finally, the final stage in this, once we've got the data into the cloud, we've deemed the right information that needs to be moved, we will then apply policy. We'll manage the governance, the retention around that content. We'll ensure discoverability. We'll ensure we can report on that data. So once we've moved it, we have full visibility of the information that we have. This final stage is going to be the subject of our next webinar in terms of how we can manage information in the cloud once we've moved it and we've moved the right data into the cloud in the first place. So that is something we can absolutely help with, and that's something we'll be discussing in a future webinar, because this is a really important topic. We can't get away from our governance and legal objectives and obligations despite moving to the cloud, so we need to make sure we do this in an effective way. So we will discuss this on a future date and how we can leverage SharePoint to achieve some of these areas. So, to summarize, what we need to do, we need to think about the challenge. We've got a lot of information, we've got a lot of data, and it's growing exponentially. So first of all, if we want to adopt a cloud-based strategy, we need to understand the information we have. First of all, at a very top level view, understand what's useful to us, what's irrelevant, and what can be moved to the cloud. And once we've done that, we can run through that analytics process to help you there. And then we need to transition. We need to cleanse, categorize, and transform that data so that when moving to the cloud and when identifying the most appropriate data to move to the cloud, we can do that effectively and appropriately. And then we can utilize our approaches, our methodologies, our solutions like DataPoint to migrate that data to the cloud. And once we've done that, we can then manage that data. And again, that is something that we'll be discussing in a future webinar. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. I'm pretty much on time for the half an hour. I do hope this is something you found useful today. I hope you've seen that, through the right approaches and understanding the kind of information that you have, we can help you adopt a cloud-based strategy, and we can help you move to the cloud, but ensuring that the right information is moved to the cloud in the first place. We're not advocating a complete move. We're not saying everything should exist in the cloud from now on. What we're saying is if you can understand the information you have, we can ensure that we can take that and ensure that the right content, the right data is moved to the cloud where appropriate, and then we can adopt the most appropriate cloud-based platforms for your needs. So there's obviously a lot of detail behind everything I've been discussing today. So for more information, you can visit our website. We have various social media channels through Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. But of course, we'd encourage you to contact us. Our email address is sales@automatedintelligence.com, probably the first best route for you, and then you'll be directed to the most appropriate person depending on the business that you're currently in. So thanks very much for your time. Really hope that was useful to you. And what we'll do now is we'll start looking at some of the questions that you've been asking throughout the session. So of course, if you do have any questions, I'd encourage you to leverage the Q&A panel that you have. And we've just had a couple of questions come in already. The first question that's come in: how quickly can you move data to the cloud? Now that's kind of the killer question. That's probably the obvious question. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a tricky one. It's a bit of a piece of string answer. Unfortunately, it's what cloud platform are you moving to? What's your how much data have you got? How much data have you got to profile? The real best way to answer that question is to look at the first stage that I discussed, the analytics approach. If we can look at that and we can understand the kind of information, the amount of information that's going to be appropriate to the cloud, what we can then start doing is analyzing that data, and then we can give better estimates in terms of how we can move to the cloud. But to give a couple of examples, there are clients that have had several terabytes of data that had a couple of months because a system has gone out of support, and we've been able to fulfill those deadlines. There are others who have huge deadlines and they want to spend a lot of time analyzing that data, working with their businesses and so forth to ensure the information is moving to the cloud in the appropriate way. So that takes a little bit longer. So it really is dependent on a number of factors, but ultimately we'll work with you to establish how long it will take to move based upon your own individual circumstances. So another question that I just had is SharePoint or Microsoft Cloud the only option? Well, it's certainly an option that we is frankly our bread and butter. We deal a lot with moving clients to Azure, managing content in things like Windows Azure, Office 365, and so forth. Microsoft's obviously cloud strategy at the moment is very public and very robust, and they're pushing it very vigorously. So it's an area we deal a lot in purely because of the popularity. But that's not to say it's the only option. You might be looking at secure government cloud or other cloud platforms that exist from other vendors. We're absolutely happy to entertain, where you're looking to move. If it's another platform you're looking at, we're never going to say it's the only option, but it's certainly an option that a lot of clients are very interested in. So it's why we kind of tend to focus on it in most cases. So another question we've kind of had come in: if we use the cloud to archive old data, what can we do to better manage this data? Can we apply policy? So absolutely a fair question, because what we don't want to do is, okay, we can move useful things to the most appropriate platform, cloud, on-premise, a combination of the two, take a hybrid approach and so forth. But if we really think about it, if we just dump all the stuff we don't need onto a cloud and leave it, then you still have to pay for it. And by and large, the chances are you're going to move more and more archive data into that platform. So we still want to apply a measure of management and governance around it for a couple of reasons. We want to apply policies so that eventually we can deprecate that data, remove it over the course of time, so we don't have to keep it indefinitely if appropriate. But of course, it's important to have some discoverability there as well. So say, for example, you have to comply with a Freedom of Information Act request. The chances are that request may need to span your archive data sources as well as your SharePoint platform. So we're going to want to be able to discover that, extract data from it and so forth. So it's still appropriate to apply policy and understand the information that is there. So what we can do with automated intelligence tools is we can actually apply that level of management and governance not only to areas like SharePoint, but also to those archive areas where you're storing information which you don't necessarily want to clog SharePoint up with. So absolutely fair question. We can help you manage that data, apply retention, and better discoverability on that information as well. So that's something we can definitely help with. So a question we've asked just come in as well is how easy is it to profile the data? Well, again, it really depends on the kind of information that you have. If we start thinking about, you might have just very broad categories. This is sensitive and this is not sensitive. And we can apply sensitivity thresholds to that as well to say if it's got a certain keyword or certain element in the content, certain type of metadata, is that going to be classed as sensitive or not? So we can use that by way of saying, well, it really depends on the kind of categorization you need to apply. If you've got lots of different types of data and they all need to be treated in different ways, that's going to be a longer process than just applying some more broader brush rules. So if there's not too much levels of categorization, we can do it relatively quickly, but you may find that actually you need to apply more rigorous policy or rigorous rules around the kind of content that you have and categorizing it appropriately. So that will take a little bit longer. So, it may take a couple of weeks to a couple of months, just really depends on the kind of information that you have. So one final question I've had is, how much does the analysis phase cost? So that phase I first talked about, the analytics, I showed you that report showing redundancy, duplication, potential cost savings. That's something we typically offer at no charge, providing there's a kind of a commitment to your users, or there's a commitment to say there is something that you'd like to do with that data. That's something we'll typically run at no charge. What I'd suggest is you contact us at sales@automatedintelligence.com and we can help you understand the best approach and how we can help you with that initial phase.